As you may remember, back in the early 60s, surfers were called surf bums. And that used to always irk me that surfing was such a beautiful sport. We weren't bums. We were just trying to live the life. And so I wanted to dispel that surf bum image and, for what it was worth, make pro surfing legitimize. And I think it worked.
That's Randy Rarick. I'm Jamie Brisick. This is Soundings, brought to you by the Surfers Journal. The Journal is a member-supported publication made possible by sponsorship from Costa Sunglasses, FCS, Finisterre, Howler Brothers, Patagonia, Rainbow Sandals, Vans, and Yeti. More like a book than a magazine, the Journal delivers 136 pages of independent storytelling every 8 weeks, covering the people, culture, travel, and art of surfing. To learn more and to subscribe, please visit surfersjournal.com. Born in Seattle, Washington in 1949, Randy Rarick moved with his family to Hawaii when he was 5. He started surfing at age 10 under the tutelage of the Waikiki Beach Boys. He was a Hawaiian state junior champ. He made the semifinals of the 1970 World Championships in Australia. In 1976, at age 26, Randy and 1968 world champion Fred Hemmings founded the IPS, which linked together what at the time were fragmented pro events around the world. They established a rating system and a world tour, which ended with the crowning of a world champion. It seems obvious today, what with the WSL, but in the mid-70s it was a giant step for professional surfing. In 1983, Randy spearheaded the Triple Crown of surfing, which linked together the 3 North Shore events, and also crowned a champion. Randy would helm the Triple Crown for the next 30 years. Randy is a surfboard shaper. He was taught how to shape by Dick Brewer and George Downing, and went on to make boards for Surfline Hawaii, Dewey Weber, and Lightning Bolt. While Randy might be one of the most widely traveled surfers of all time, having ridden waves in over 70 countries, he's called the North Shore home since 1969 and has lived in the same house at Sunset Beach for more than 50 years. He surfs out front, i.e. his backyard, regularly. So Randy, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure to be here. I'm stoked to tune in with all your podcast listeners. It's kind of cool.
Yes. I wanted to start with something that you and I talked about off stage, so to speak, where you had told me about getting on a ship from Hawaii to Australia and how things had changed, and this was in the 60s. And if you could tell this story, I think it's a great way in.
Well, I think what's interesting is I met Bob McTavish in 1967. He came over here for the Duke Classic, and Fred Van Dyke was running the tournament, and I was kind of like a runner for Fred. And he says, hey, go to the airport and pick this Australian guy up. His name's Bob McTavish, and he's going to be competing. So I actually went to Honolulu Airport, picked up McTavish, and then immediately established a rapport with him. He came back to the North Shore, surfed the Duke Classic, which is when he introduced the V-bottom, and I got to be good friends with him. So I said, I'd really like to come to Australia. And that was in the winter of 67. So early 68, I boarded a P&O liner and took 2 boards with me and headed to Australia. And it took about 14 days to go from Honolulu to Sydney. We stopped in Fiji, and I surfed in Fiji on the way there. And then it was interesting. I arrived in Sydney, and an old-time kind of a hero of Australian surfing, a guy named Snowy McAllister, was there to meet me. And I arrived, and it was funny because I got off this P&O liner and my boards were down in the hold, and I had to climb down in the hold and get them and bring them back up and walk off the ship. And then Snowy took me to Manly Beach that same day, and I arrived literally from the ship straight to the beach. And the guys laughed at me because they said, mate, your boards are obsolete. I had left Hawaii. I was on the Weber team, and I left Hawaii with a 9.6 Weber Stylus pintail, which was sort of the hot shape in 67, early 68. and a Weber feather, which was an 810. And I thought, oh, I was really ahead of the game. And I got to Sydney, Australia, and everybody was already on 8-foot boards. So it shows you how fast the shortboard revolution was happening and how quickly the Aussies were actually finally ahead of the game as far as design-wise.
Incredible. And I think it's so interesting, that period, and I missed it, but I'm fascinated by it. And we've had Bob McTavish on the show. We've had Nat Young on the show. We've had people who are big figures in that transition or shift. But what was it like? I mean, what was it like to sort of watch surfboard design change so radically?
Well, I was really lucky because I grew up here in Hawaii, and I got into the industry at a pretty young age. At 14 years old, I started working at Surfline Hawaii. Dick Metz actually gave me my first job, and I was working in the repair shop. So I was exposed to the longboard era quite significantly because our job was fixing boards back in those days. So this is, 64, 65. It was during the longboard era. And then the shortboard era began with McTavish. Really, that contest that he surfed in was what I call the shot across the bow of changing the whole thing, because Nat Young had rode a shorter board in the 66 World Contest in San Diego, but in America, the things hadn't really changed yet. They were still riding pretty much longboards in 67. So really, that was the beginning. And being young enough, I was exposed to all the heavyweight guys like Fred Hemmings and Paul Strow and Butch Van Arsdale and all the longboard heavyweights. But I was young enough that for me, I was able to adapt from the longboard to the beginning of the shortboard era quite handily. So it was very interesting to see the Hawaiian connection, the Australians taking the lead, and then the Californians, the big manufacturers, trying to play catch up at that stage of the game.
Mm-hmm. And you were deep into shaping at this time, correct?
Actually, at that stage, I was still mostly a repair guy. I had George Downing had taught me how to shape, and I was just as the short board thing came in. In fact, George saw McTavish's board at the Duke meet. That same next day, he came back to the Greg Knoll shop, which is where he worked, and I was a repair guy there, and George shaped me a V-bottom board. So he was teaching me how to shape. He basically shaped me a board because the boards that were coming out of Southern California that we were selling in Hawaii basically were obsolete by that stage. Literally by the week, boards were changing. I mean, guys were experimenting with fins, with shortness, and going to shorter and shorter and shorter. And it was just a really heady time. And at the same time, the big West Coast manufacturers were trying to unload all these longboards that were still in stock. And I was working here in Hawaii, and we had already decided, we're going to make boards here because the guys on the mainland can't make them fast enough to show the changes. And literally, by the time they'd make a board, ship it to Hawaii, that board was actually obsolete. And Greg Knoll dealership, the Hobie dealership here, and all the other guys, they were just scrambling, trying to get rid of their longboards because boards were going shorter, narrower, and getting really trippy shaping by 1968.
Wow. Were you there in 1966 at the World Titles in San Diego when Nat Young rode Magic Sam?
No, but what's interesting is as soon as that contest finished, he was real good friends with Steve Bigler, and Bigler rode for Harbor. So Nat gave the board to Bigler and said, ship this board to Hawaii, because he was going to go off and go skiing or do something after the World Championship. And so that board came to Hawaii, and I was actually the last guy to see that board. It came into the shop. It was dinged up. I took a look at it, and what was interesting, once again, is by the time that board came to Hawaii in late 66, it was completely obsolete. It had a soft V bottom on it, had Magic Sam written on the bottom, and it had this big giant Greeno fin that was about an inch thick and really foiled out. And so I studied that board, really took a look at it, but we're getting shorter and shorter by that stage. So that board was basically throwaway, and somebody came and picked that board up and it disappeared and it's never been found again. And that would be a holy grail to find that board.
Wow. So I know that you were a competitive surfer and did very well in competitions. What you're certainly known for in the history books is kind of the co-founding with Fred Hemmings of the IPS in 1976. And I think a lot of our listeners probably wouldn't have a lot of context for what that was like. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I was a competitive surfer when I was in my teenage years, and I won the Hawaii State Junior Championships when I was 17, and then right then is when boards started going short. And I was in the Duke meet. I was in this first Smirnoff here in Hawaii in 1970, and we were getting shorter and shorter. And we could see the essence of there was beginning to get some prize money. And the first Duke meet that Mike Doyle won in 1968, they gave $1,000 away. And then they decided to start giving the purses out. Fred Hemmings started the Pipeline Masters in 1971 with $1,000 purse for the whole thing. And I took off and began a lot of world traveling. I surfed in the amateur titles were kind of the big event back then in 1970. And that's the one that Rolf Arness won down in Johanna in Australia. And I actually made the semifinal, so I got invited to South Africa. And Ernie Thompson, Sean's dad, extended an invitation for me to come out there. So I went out really early in 1971 to South Africa, and they had what was known as the Gunston 500, which is an early pro event. So there was the Gunston 500 in South Africa. There was a contest at Bells Beach in Australia. And they started giving money away in the early 70s, about 72, 73. I realized, this was going to be the future. I saw ahead of time that pro surfing was going to take off. At that stage, you got to realize California guys were all wearing black wetsuits. Soul surfing was happening. Competition was not in vogue at all in California. Here in Hawaii, Fred was doing a good job running the Pipe Masters, and they had the Smirnoff. And so I saw the writing on the wall. I said, pro surfing is going to happen here, and I'm going to do something about it. So after traveling around the world for 2 years, I had surfed in the Gunston, I'd surfed in Australia, I'd been to Brazil, and I thought, you know what, we got to get something together here. So I came back to Hawaii in 1975, and I said to Fred, we need to figure out a way to standardize the judging system, because there was a 10-point system, there was a 20-point system, there was a man-on-man thing that was about ready to come in, and it was just, there was no regularity to the whole thing. So I said, we got to standardize the judging system, and we got to come up with a way to invite guys to these contests, because back then it was like, if you were pals with Fred and you got into the Pipe Masters or the Smirnoff Pro, and if you got your picture on the cover of Surfer Magazine, that was like legitimacy enough to get invited. But there was good surfers that were not getting invited, so we created what was known as the Pro Class Trials. Bernie Baker pegged that, Jack Shipley, the head judge for Hawaii, we formed that. And I went to Fred and I said, if we run this contest, will you pick 6 guys to put them in the Smirnoff Pro? And he said, yeah. And so then we said, you know what, let's take that a step further. Let's actually come up with a rating system. And in 1976, we'd actually almost finished 2/3 of the tour. There had been events in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, U.S. mainland, and we're coming into the Hawaii season. So I came up with a system to rate the surfers, which was really simple. It was a 10% reduction system where you got 1,000 points for first, 850 for second, and like that. And I approached Fred and I said, let's form this association. I knew all the guys from being traveling around the world. And I said, I contacted Bill Bowman from Australia. I contacted Peter Burness in South Africa. I contacted Graham Cassidy down in Australia, Doug Warbrook at Bells. I knew all the guys that were running events. I said, will you guys all sign on to this fledgling tour? And we called it International Professional Surfing. And we didn't call it International Professional Surfers because we didn't want it to be an association of surfers. We wanted it to be a tour, a league perhaps. And so we figured out this rating system and counted the points, ran the Hawaiian events. And at the end of the season, Peter Townend emerged with the most points and was the world champion. So I got to put a little sidebar in here. PT, I said, he wanted me to adopt a system they were using in Australia. The Australian Professional Surfers Association had a 15% reduction system. And I didn't like that because it spread the points out. And he said, no, you got to use the Aussie system. I said, no, we're going to use my system, and that's going to be the way we're going to go. And had I used PT system, Ian Cairns would have ended up being the first world champion. So I always tell PT, you're lucky that I used my system, or you never would have been the world champion.
Incredible story. And Trying to get a sense of that, and you'd mentioned that there was a period where there were many purists who didn't think competition was what surfing was about. Did you, as you as the sort of as the IPS gained traction, was there resistance? Were there people who hated the idea of surfing moving towards something like tennis or golf?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, particularly it came from Southern California. The Californians really weren't into it. Like I said, that was kind of the soulful black wetsuit era, and competition was not happening. So one famous quote guy said to Fred Hemmings, he says, "You're fornicating with Mother Nature." Yeah. We just kind of went, take it as you want. It's the future. We saw the writing on the wall. I certainly saw it because I was kind of a journeyman competitor, and I had some decent results, but I never was going to win a world title. So I said, let's get organized. Let's get the administration going, and it really took off. And you got to realize this was kind of down during the period when the Aussies and the South Africans were making their mark on the North Shore, and they showed up, and their whole game plan was to, rip, tear, lacerate, as they said. And they wanted to prove that they could surf as good as the Hawaiians. Because up to that point, you had Jeff Hackman, you had Barry Kanaipuni, you had Jerry Lopez, and Hawaii was really regarded as the center of the universe in that sense. And the Aussies and a couple of the handful of South Africans, they really wanted to make it happen. So they were really pushing for it. And you saw the early results. It was PT, and then it was Sean, and then it was Rabbit, and then it was Mark Richards. So that generation of guys really embraced pro surfing, and they took it and ran with it. And it made our life easy because I was able to go out and get sponsors like Rolex and Pan Am, and we got, the fledgling tour up and running, and the prize money went from $10,000 to, 15, then it went to 20, and then it went in leaps and bounds. And then the other thing that people don't realize is this was the basis for the quote surf industry to really kick off. When you think about it, the Quicksilvers, the Rip Curls, the Billabongs all got started right around that time period, and they were all run by surfers. And those guys, if it was a bean counter, they would never have listened to these guys because it didn't make sense, from a commercial point of view. But they poured a lot of money into pro surfing because they wanted to see it happen. And a lot of the early pro guys thought, oh, if I could get a paycheck, then I just go surfing and I don't have to work. And that was the emphasis behind a lot of these companies getting started. And then they started really doing well. And it was the growth of pro surfing is obviously where it is today.
Yes. What was your motivation? What drove you to want to spearhead and kind of take competitive surfing into this next level?
I think it was growing up in Hawaii. I saw all the great Hawaiian surfers and have great reverence for, my peers. I just, looked on at these guys and I was like, wow. And then my generation was Jeff Hackman, Jerry Lopez, Jimmy Blears, myself. We were all the guys, the next, we're the kids. And we all said, hey, it would be really cool to get paid to go surfing. We thought, you got to realize it's the early 70s. This is, when drug dealing was going on crazy. There was guys, smuggling stuff everywhere. And everybody was looking for a way out of having to work so they could go surf. And my impetus was, hey, if we could organize professional surfing, you could actually get paid to just go surfing and be a good surfer. And, like I said, I won the Hawaii State Championship. I was surfed in the early pro events. And I saw the writing on the wall, as I said earlier, that pro surfing was going to happen. So my emphasis is, one, I really had pride in making Hawaii work. And I wanted Hawaii to maintain its presence as a powerhouse in the surfing world. But I'd been to Australia, I'd been to South Africa, and I saw that the rest of the world was just as hungry. And if we could bring people to really good surf, and at that stage, Hawaii had the best surf, let them do their thing, and the best surfers would rise to the top, and the cream would show that these guys deserve the accolades that they get for being a great surfer.
Mm-hmm. Were you looking to other sports as models? Did you look to tennis? Did you look to golf?
We just kind of winged it, to be honest with you. I mean, the first year I was, quote, the competition director, so I would go around the world to all these early events that we rated, and I would add up the results on a napkin, from the bar after the contest was done. And it was fairly, I mean, really innocent and really naivety on our part. So we looked at tennis, we looked at Formula One, and we adapted, like I said, the rating system to some extent. But surfing was different. It wasn't like any other bat, ball, or stick type of sport. So, and judging was a major area that of needed help because there was a lot of biasness. The Hawaiians like the Hawaiian style, the Aussies like the more dominant style, and it really was like, how can we make this fair for everybody? And that was my goal for the 8 years that I was involved running the IPS. Was I really want to make this fair. I don't want to be favorable to Hawaii just because I'm from Hawaii. So it was like, let's take this, let's turn it into a legitimate sport. As you may remember, back in the early 60s, surfers were called surf bums. And that used to always irk me, that surfing was such a beautiful sport. We weren't bums. We were just trying to live the life. And so I wanted to dispel that surf bum image and, for what it was worth, make pro surfing legitimize. And I think it worked. I think in 1976, things really changed where surfing went from a lifestyle to an actual sport. Before that, there was a bit of prize money here and there, but pro surfing didn't exist. So the start of the IPS tour is what really changed things. It made professional surfing, legitimized it, and from there on, the last 50 years, it's grown to what it is today.
Yeah, no, I think the film Busting Down the Door really captures that well. And I know, having talked to Sean Thompson, Robert Bartholomew, Ian PT, and Mark Richards, it seemed that those athletes who were at the top of their game and who were leading the rankings at that time, they really contributed too, right? It was sort of a collective of a vision and having the dream very much alive in all the athletes too.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it was Ben Marcus coined this slogan. He says, "Randy, you're the Forrest Gump of surfing because you've seen it all," and it's true. Like I said, I grew up here in the early 60s, saw the longboard era. At that stage, there was really no money. It was all about the accolades of, the world titles. Then the busting down the door era came along, and that changed, and professional surfing took off. Then professional surfing matured in the 80s when all those, as I said earlier, those surf companies became, powerhouse companies and began to direct the sport. And surfing became super fashionable. I mean, in Japan, I remember going to Japan and seeing hundreds and hundreds of surfers out in 1 foot surf because it was fashionable to be a surfer. California changed its attitude. Joey Baran came along and that generation of guys, and they kind of adopted what the Australians had done in the late 70s. In the early mid 80s, all of a sudden, pro surfing in California took off. And then Hawaii obviously expanded, and then Europe came into the fore, and so really surfing became not just a lifestyle, but a professionalism that legitimized the sport, and it spread worldwide. So, for good or bad, some people say, you ruined it because there's more surfers than there should be. But who are we to say to deny anybody else that want to have the same pleasure that we had?
Yep. Yeah. And being on the North Shore at that time, I mean, the North Shore was kind of the epicenter, the Mecca. Can you talk a little bit about what the North Shore meant?
Oh, yeah. Well, like I said, growing up in Hawaii, even when I was in the early 60s, used to look at the early surf movies and watch Pat Curran and Peter Cole and Buzzy Trent. Those guys ride Waimea, and I go, oh my gosh. And then I finally remember at 16, I came out and actually surfed Waimea, and I said, and now I see what these guys were doing. So you have the early pioneer guys in the late 50s, early 60s that sort of set the tone. Then you sort of have the hippie era of the latter 60s, in which, there was no TV here till the early 80s almost, and it was really a backwater. And people only came here to surf, and all the little beach cottages belonged to people from Honolulu. And during the summer, they would come out because there was no surf, and in the winter, they would just be empty, and nobody would be here but the surfers. And then really what happened was in the early 70s, as competition began to take hold, Fred started the Pipe Masters in 71. We already had the Smirnoff going. We had the World Cup in 75. And by the mid 70s, all of a sudden the epicenter came to the North Shore. That's when the era of the surf magazine, Surfer, Surfing, and all the other ones. And it was, you had to come to Hawaii. Hawaii was the Mecca, and you had to come and do your stuff on the North Shore, cut your chops out here. And if you were going to be anybody in the world of surfing, this is where you made it. So, you know, I had guys like Dan Merkel and Bernie Baker and Wilkins and all those guys shooting, you know, divine, great shots for the magazines. And then the surf movies changed from 16 millimeter, and then they got into, you know, video, and then that was the next major explosion of surfing. And so the North Shore went from a sleepy little town to kind of a hippie town to all of a sudden very in, and then they built the Turtle Bay, and then the whole North Shore became discovered. So it's ironic when you go around the world, you go to Bali or you go to South Africa or you go to the Gold Coast of Australia, all these surf destinations have been built up and turned into giant metropolises. And the North Shore, ironically, is still pretty much the same. It's still keep the country country. And even though there's more people than ever, it's just certainly more crowded. The actual vibe on the North Shore hasn't really changed that much in the last 50 years.
It just takes a little longer to get from Sunset Beach to Laniakea. So, and this kind of segues neatly into you running the Triple Crown from, I believe it was 1983 to 2012. So that's like 30 seasons.
Actually, yeah. I mean, that's for the Triple Crown, and you know, I was doing the events prior to that. So, I actually conducted and ran events for 38 years before I finally retired. I got to tell your listeners the reason the Triple Crown came into being was Ian Cairns started the ASP. They basically did a coup. They overthrew the IPS, and the Association of Surfing Professional, ASP, came into being. Ian pretty much retired. PT was one of his cohorts, and those guys had been the competitors in the 70s and the early 80s. So by the early mid 80s, it was ready for a sea change, and I think timing was right for that. But this coup happened. ASP got overthrown. But what Ian did was he wanted to really insert his authority, and so he banned anybody competing in the Hawaiian events because there was a big kind of disagreement between Fred Hemmings and Ian Cairns, and they banned the surfers from competing in the Triple Crown. Well, PT, or not PT, but Bobby Owens, Hans Hedeman, Dane K. Aloha, those guys all said, screw that, we're going to surf the Hawaii events. So there was a big deal that they got their points stripped away, and they had to pay a fine. And I think Hans and Michael Ho paid the fine, and Bobby Owens and Dane didn't pay the fine, and that cost them their career. But what we did was we used to decide the world title here on the North Shore. Well, they rejigged the tour to finish in Australia. So all of a sudden the Hawaiian events weren't as important. So we created the Triple Crown, where we linked the Hawaiian Pro, which was usually held at Haleiwa. We linked the Pipeline Masters, which is obviously at Pipeline, and the World Cup of Surfing at Sunset, and linked those three events together, gave a points per position on those, and whoever had the most points into that became the Triple Crown champion. Well, what happened is the Triple Crown grew into this huge promotion and outstripped the world title at times. And more people liked and thought about the Triple Crown as being the unofficial world title than the actual world title. And so I realized, hey, I'm going to really promote the Triple Crown. And so from 1983, I lost my position, resigned my position in the IPS. The ASP came along, and I said, okay, I'm going to just focus on Hawaii. And so, like I said, for the next 30 years, we really promoted and built up the Triple Crown to what it was, and had great prize money, terrific support from Vans. Actually took over in the late 80s. And, the thing grew to be, as I said, more important than the world title, especially for the Hawaiians.
And being at the front of, or the helm, I should say, of the Triple Crown for all those years, is there a highlight for you? Was there a moment where you felt like it was at its best, or surfing was at its best?
I watched all, 30 years, like literally 3 or 4 generations of surfers come and go. From the guys like the Hoey brothers won the first handful of Triple Crowns. And then I was, handing out jerseys to Coco and Mason Hull, Michael's kids. And then same thing, I watched the air of the hose in the beginning, and then the Sonny Garcias. Then in the '90s, when Kelly Slater came along and dominated, and then the emergence of Andy Irons, and then all these champions and different generations. I watched. I mean, I handed out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, gave a zillion contest jerseys out. I knew every single surfer on a first name basis. So that's kind of it. What was interesting, it kept me on top of, even though I was getting older, it kept me on top of what was happening. And I would have to say, you'd have to just go air by air, because there's different generations where boards change. I'd have to say the rivalry between Kelly and Andy, to me, was the best part of the Triple Crown, because Andy came along and had finally the drive, the chops to be able to knock Kelly off his throne, and he did so, winning world titles himself. And the rivalry between those two guys, I think, was the pinnacle of the Triple Crown. But for me, the one personal guy that I really liked was Rob Machado. When Rob, had the high five with Kelly and lost the world title there, and then I think it was 2000, Rob went on to win the Pipe Masters. And it was the first Pipe Masters in a long time that was only lefts, because so many guys have won Pipeline going right, and the back door has made the decision on the Pipe Masters. But that was the one year, it was all lefts. Rob was in his stride, and it was, perfect left west swell pipeline, and he won decisively. And that always, to me, for the Pipe Masters, was my favorite, because it really showed what pipeline was all about. And as I said, the rivalry between Kelly and Andy, I think, was the peak of the Triple Crown run. And unfortunately, when the WSL came along and superseded the ASP, the last 10 years, they diminished the value of the Triple Crown to the point where, they've basically gotten rid of it completely.
Although it's back now, right? It's sort of all roads lead to Mecca. The tour will finish in pipe at on the North Shore again, right?
A real quick thing on that. Back in, when ASP came along, like I said, in the early 80s, they moved the tour to Australia, and it lasted for 2 or 3 years, and they realized what a mistake that was, so they moved it back to Hawaii. A whole nother generation went by in the early 90s. Graham Cassidy took over the ASP. He moved the tour back to Australia again. And once again, the years that the tour was being held in Australia and finished in Australia are somewhat, I'm not going to say forgettable, but the guys that won it didn't have the legitimacy of the guys who won when it was held in Hawaii. But when the guys won in Hawaii, it really gave it some significance. And so when they moved it a third time, not to Australia this time, but to Trestles, I went, history repeats itself. And if you can't learn from your own history, you don't know. So here's 5 years later, they've moved it back, coming back to Hawaii. So it's happened 3 times now where they took it away from Hawaii, took it away from Pipeline, thought they could reinvent the wheel, didn't happen. And now, thank goodness, it's coming back to the North Shore, which is where it should be. So a little bit of politics involved in all that, and a little historical lesson. But like I said, hopefully this coming year, when it's back at Pipeline, we'll see the glory days again.
No, it's so true. And I think the Trestles is not a gladiator pit the way Pipeline is. I've watched decades now of those world titles decided at or the final event coming down to Pipeline, and oftentimes deciding a world title. And it is just so damn exciting to see tube riding and big beautiful waves pouring over the reef.
No doubt about it. I mean, the last really good one, I think, was when Gabby and Italo squared off. They were the number 1, 2 guys when the Brazilian Storm really was dominating, and it went bracket by bracket down. It came down to the finals, and it was number 1 and number 2. And what a better way to decide a world championship! And that was one of the most exciting contests at Pipeline that I've seen, and I've seen them all. I've watched literally every single Pipe Master. And like I said, that was exciting, and that's the way it should be. So hopefully Mother Nature will provide the waves, and the guys, taking nothing away from, Felipe Toledo or any of the other guys, great surfers and superb competitors. But as you said, the gladiator pit at Pipeline, and you throw in a couple little local wild cards, mixes it up, and it makes it really interesting. And that's what the fans want to see. They want to see blood, glory, and guts at Pipeline. And I think hopefully it'll be back to that.
Yes, yes. And so, Randy, having watched so much great surfing over the seasons, and as you said earlier, being on a first name basis and knowing so many of these guys, is there a common quality or kind of personality trait? Is there something that you see in the greats that that sort of is common to all of them?
Yeah, I mean, there's that drive. The Aussies particularly really have it, and then, as I said, the Brazilian Storm came along, and those guys had it even more. It's kind of like in the '70s when Sean and Mr. and Rabbit and those guys, they were hungry. They wanted to do it. So in the late '70s, early '80s, they made their mark. And then, Kelly, same thing, that drive, that domination, that desire to win, during the, 10, 15 years where Kelly was just dominating competition as well. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Brazilian Storm came along, and those guys were coming out of being nobodies. Nobody even thought about the Brazilians in the, first 2 decades of pro surfing, and they wanted to prove their point. They were hungry, and the system changed to their advantage for sure, but they certainly had the drive. So I think it's always been those people that have the drive, have the desire, and then once they reach that pinnacle, unfortunately for a lot of them, there's nowhere else for them to go. You can only go down. And so the guys like Sean Thompson, who became statesmen of the sport, are the ones who could handle the not being a champion anymore. So many pro surfers, so many surfers, once they reach the top, they don't realize there's nowhere else to go. And it's really hard, that fall from grace for those guys. So you got to have the desire, you got to have the passion, obviously you got to have the talent, but you also got to have a clear head to take it, beyond the years of when you're on top.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and it can be so cruel. And I think I've been watching it for enough generations now to observe how, yeah, what can be such a kind of coveted place can become a curse later on in one's life. And I think that thing of being chaired up the beach at Pipeline while thousands are applauding you is probably incredibly wonderful in the moment, but all the kind of rewiring that's happening to your nervous system in that moment, you cut to like 10 years later, and it can be the thing that, leads you to drugs and alcohol, etc.
Oh yeah, no, it's many a surfers unfortunately have taken that toll, and that's why for me, I've been in the industry for 65 years, and I always had the desire to experience everything in surfing and not put all my marbles in one basket. So over the years, like I said, I've competed, I've run contests, I've showed surf movies, I've shaped boards, I've done almost anything and everything you can do in surfing, because I didn't want to be just a one-trick pony. I wanted to experience it all. And the other thing is, like you mentioned, drugs, unfortunately, have taken their toll over the years, and particularly back in the '60s and '70s when, drugs really came on the scene hard. A lot of good talent got wasted and went by the wayside. And it's a cautionary tale to see what happened to those people. And hopefully for, the future generations, they make note of that.
Yes, for sure. In all your years, is there a favorite surfer that you've observed, or a favorite session with a surfer at a particular wave?
I think you actually have to break it into eras, and eras is both a time thing and an equipment thing. So, in the '60s, my favorite surfer on the North Shore was Paul Stroud, because he was just the most beautiful, gentlemanly surfer and had the best style. Then the '60s came along, and I think after the '60s into the early '70s, the transition to shortboards, to me, Jeff Hackman was the man. I mean, Hackman rode Sunset better than everywhere. I live at Sunset, so I'm obviously a fan of good surfing at Sunset. On that note, in the early pro days, the guy at Sunset that I thought surfed the best was Gary Elkerton. Kong was just dominant at Sunset Beach. And then you had Sonny Garcia. He won 6 world Triple Crown titles, and Sonny was just super good at Sunset as well. And then, of course, you can't, the GOAT, Kelly Slater rode everywhere in Hawaii really good, except Sunset. But I watched Kelly from being a little, 12, 14-year-old kid growing up surfing Pipeline, backdoor, and, you can't say enough about what a great surfer he was. And the other thing is Kelly was great for the sport. He was a really good champion who people admired and to this day still do. And that's really hard to, get the best in your, become the best at your game and then still be a great ambassador to the sport. And, unfortunately, a lot of guys, the younger guys, are really good surfers, but they're not really good ambassadors to the sport. So you have to kind of balance the quality and the ability to project your image and what surfing is. Because I think everybody that's a pro surfer owes something to the world of surfing to do the best they can and do the best they can for the image of surfing. So, there's a lot of hot young kids now that are surfing really good. And, with John stepping away, we got a whole new crop of guys that are not really well known. They're not household words for a lot of people, but I think on any given day, there's a great surfing going on the North Shore. And whether it be Pipeline, Sunset, or Rocky Point, it doesn't matter. You're going to see the best surfing in the world happen in Hawaii still.
Mm-hmm. Having been on the scene for moments such as the one I'm going to kind of allude to right now, I would imagine like there were times when you were doing this where it felt incredibly thankless. And I say that because I think sometimes, and it's the nature of the competition, it's the nature of a lot of the guys at the peak of their game being very young and immature and not recognizing how much you're doing and how they just sort of think that this thing exists and they don't realize that actually someone's put a lot of time and energy and elbow grease into spearheading it and trying to move it towards something positive. And I've seen sort of punk surfers shouting at you as if like you are, that judge that gave them the score that they didn't want or they lost for whatever reason, blaming it on you. So did you suffer that a lot? Did you have like some 18-year-old kid shouting at you and you're thinking, kid, you have no idea?
You summed it up pretty good there. Growing up in Hawaii, you learn to be humble. Being a haole in Hawaii, and even though I was pretty much a local haole, I learned, the other side of the coin. So I think the upbringing of growing up in Hawaii really helped me. I've got an incredible amount of tolerance. I'm super patient. And at the same time, I saw the injustices, especially for the Hawaiians, how they, got trampled on from, 100 years ago when the white man first came and losing their land and being taken advantage of. And the Hawaiian people are the most beautiful, nicest people. And if you're friends with a Hawaiian and they're friendly with you, you can't ask for anything more. And, over the years, I used to go out to Makaha where Buffalo Kealana and his whole family was. And I used to love hanging out with them. And when I come over, they'd welcome me in. I never had a hassle. And I never got into a fight. And you hear all the horror stories about the North Shore and what's happening. And when pro surfing came along, I made this dedication to myself. I've told the story to many people. I met Duke Kahanamoku when I was 16, 17, and the Duke told me, and just to paraphrase, he said, what you give to surfing, you'll get back to surfing many times over. And I took that to heart. And then the Duke, was my inspiration to do the best job I could. And, I got threats. I've had guys pull up in front of my house with guns and threaten me. I've had, guys want to punch me out. The North Shore, I've been abused by everybody. People that hate the traffic, hate the tourists that come with a surf contest, the rubbish that's created. I've taken it. I used to belong to the North Shore Community Association and the Sunset Beach Community Association, the Chamber of Commerce of Haleiwa. And I used to go to those meetings and just get shit on by everybody, just, hammering me. But in the end, my commitment to surfing, as the Duke said, what you put out, you will get back tenfold. And I'm really proud of the Triple Crown on them. I'm really proud of the surfboards I've shaped. I'm really proud of the people I've guided. And so, I would take nothing back. When I went to Australia for that first year back when I was 18, I came back, thought I would get a job and get a real job. And I opened a surf shop and I never looked back. So surfing has been my life. I've committed myself to do the best I can and give everything I can to surfing. And, I feel proud about it. So despite all the setbacks, and I can name names and individuals who, you've all heard stories about and what life on the North Shore is about, but there's no point in going through that. It's been hard, but it's been self-satisfying as well.
I'm happy to hear that. And now shifting more to you personally, because I think being at the forefront of competitive surfing, professional surfing for so many years, there's that. But you, as I understand it, you learned to surf from the Waikiki Beach Boys, right?
Yeah, actually, Rabbit Kekai, the famous beach boy who learned from Duke Kahanamoku, he taught me how to surf and shoved me into my first wave when I was 10 years old. And I never looked back. And it was always fun because later on, when I took over the Triple Crown, we hired Rabbit to be our beach marshal for like 15 years till he passed away. And he was always an inspiration to me. And everybody that came up to him loved Rabbit. And once again, that's about, like I was saying about the Hawaiians. The Hawaiians will give you the time of day. They'll give you the shirt off their back. They are the best people as long as you treat them with respect. And you can't find a better, group of people than the Hawaiians. When the Hawaiians are in their forward, they are the best to be around. And Rabbit personified that, along with the other classic old Beach Boys of the air. And that air has kind of gone by the wayside with commercialization. I mean, there's 10 million tourists that come to Waikiki. It's pretty hard to show that aloha spirit all the time, but they give it a go.
No, and I got to meet Rabbit, and I remember him being at the Beach Marshal at all the events. And the wonderful thing is, sometimes we'd be picking up our jersey before paddling out into giant, scary surf, and Rabbit always had a joke for you. He was always so lighthearted. What were the Beach Boys like? There are probably a lot of listeners who have heard the word Waikiki Beach Boys, but they really don't have a kind of image conjured in their heads. What was it like in real time?
Well, I got just sort of the tail end of the classic era of the Beach Boys back in the what they called the steamboat eras, when the tourists used to come by the old Matson liners. It was 4 days from the West Coast to here by boat. You get off the boat, there's this, pre-jet air, and the Beach Boys would teach you how to surf. They would take you out in a canoe. In the evenings, they would play ukulele for you. They would dance hula. They would, basically show you that spirit of aloha, and then obviously hope to get a big tip out of it. But the old classic, Panama Dave and Squirrely and on and on. They all had funny nicknames. That was probably the best air, and I got the tail end of those guys when I was in my teens, because Blackie and those guys would cheer me on. My mom was a florist. What is now the Hilton Hawaiian Village used to be called the Kaiser Hawaiian Village. Actually, that's why the surf spot Kaiser's is named after them, because he blew a hole in the reef, and so he could get his boats in. But my mom was a florist, and she'd have to work, and so I used to hang out on the beach in Waikiki when I was young. And, I knew guys like Nuiva and Barry Kanaiapuni, and, the early guys that were, my age group. And we looked up to these Beach Boys who really had that spirit of aloha, showed people what hospitality meant by the Hawaiian style. And if you had a chance to experience any of that, that was great.
Hmm. Hmm. And then from there, you fell under the tutelage of Dick Brewer and George Downing as shaping mentors, right?
Correct. So, as I said, I started fixing boards when I was this is another little story I tell. 11 years old, I walked into a surfboard factory. It was a short-term thing that Velzy set up here in Hawaii. It lasted for about 9 months. But I walked into that factory, and the smell of resin was just intoxicating to me. And I went, oh, this is so cool. I want to make surfboards. So at 11 years old, I decided to get involved in surfing. I started fixing boards. And in our neighborhood, I told all the guys in the neighborhood, you guys buy the materials, I'll do all the repairs for free. Well, nobody knew how to fix boards. So I had guys like Jerry Lopez and Dennis Pang and Mark Cunningham. Mark Fu was our paper boy. That area that we lived on the Southeast Shore was a hotbed of talent. And everybody would ding their boards because it was surfing these reef breaks when at low tide, the reef sticking up. So there was always a lot of nose dings and skeg break-offs. And so I fixed all these boards. So I got hired by Dick Metz at 14 years old to go to work. And I mean, child labor laws weren't in effect in those days. And I started fixing boards after school and on weekends. And I mentored first under, Brewer taught me how to shape beginning wise because he was shaping for Bing in the mid 60s. And then George, as I said, in 67, sort of took me under his wing and showed me how to band rails and take cuts. And then I worked for the Greg Knoll shop here. And so I got into shaping boards, and so as shortboards came into vogue, and you got to realize this is before shaping machines, so there was a big demand for shapers. I started shaping, and I've probably shaped at least 15,000 surfboards, and mostly during the 70s, during the air pre computer days.
Fantastic. And what do you love most about shaping?
Just the creative process, and especially when shortboards came in. In the early 70s, I took board, I surfed this place called Point Panic, which is a right-hand break, which you actually can't surf anymore. It's a body surfing spot on the South Shore, but it's a really good wave when it's good. And I used to make these little small boards. When boards went ultra short in the early 70s, we took the pendulum and swung it too far. I was kind of following the Aussie lead, and I went down to riding a 4'6" board. And I'm over 6 feet tall, so that was tough. And at Point Panic, I used to shape a board, glass it, hot coat it, never finish the board because you take the board out. There was no leashes in those days. You lose it on the rocks. And I went through about 50 surfboards at Point Panic, and people would shake their heads. One little story is a beautiful south swell. It was about 4 or 5 feet. I pulled up in my van, and I had 5 boards in the van that were all glass with a red bottom, white deck. And I was able to make the boards for about $35 in those days because we used reject blanks and just, like I said, laminate them, don't even finish them. Went out, caught a couple waves, lost the board on the rocks, boom, paddling. All the body surfers are cheering me because they think I'm done. Pull out another one, exact same look, just a different bottom shape. Go out, ride a couple waves, lose that one on the rocks, boom, come in, get another. I went through 5 boards in one day on the rocks at Point Panic, and the body surfers were just shocked. But it established the fact that they would put up with me, even though nobody else was able to surf over there.
Wow, wow. And Randy, I know you're one of the great travelers in surfing. You've been to so many places. I know. I think at last count that's sort of available in the Encyclopedia of Surfing is 60 countries. Where are you at now?
I'm up to about 70. So it's, that's another thing. Growing up in Hawaii, everybody wanted to come to Hawaii because they all heard stories about the good surf here. Well, when you're in Hawaii, you want to see what the rest of the world's like. So I used surfing as a basis and decided at a young age. My first trip actually was like to California when I was 15. And I was in cultural shock when I came from Hawaii to California because I couldn't believe the car culture, the girls, how much you could find everything in California. And I went, that trip kind of lit the fire in me. I said, wow, this is really cool. I want to go see what the rest of the world's like, and I want to use surfing. So at 18, I went, like I said, to Australia, and I lived down there for almost a year, up and down the whole coast of Australia. Surfed in Fiji, Samoa, and a couple other islands in the Pacific on the way coming and going. And then the early 70s was sort of the golden age of travel when you had Naughton and Peterson and those guys, and everybody was out trying to find new surf spots. The endless summer and set the tone. Go look for the perfect wave. And I remember I showed the endless summer for Bruce Brown here when I was 14. I put up posters, watched the Cape St. Francis segment. I said I'm going to go there, and it took me 7 years later, but I made it to South Africa, and that was the beginning of, okay, I'm going to go look for surf. And so I set out, especially during our June, July, August, when it's flat on the North Shore, to go find waves somewhere else in the world. And in doing so, I surfed the entire coast of Africa. I surfed all over the Pacific. I've surfed the coast of Australia. I've been up and down both sides of South America. So I'm up to about 70 countries now, and it's been a great ambassador role of introducing surfing. Like during my West African tours in the 70s, I surfed many spots that nobody had ever seen a surfer before. And, I could have named 100 surf spots that were the first time anybody had ever surfed it. So surfing is great. Travel surfing is even better. And if you could travel, surf, and enjoy getting good waves wherever you go, the icing's on the cake. But the best part for me is I always come home to Hawaii, so I can't complain a bit.
That all sounds so good. Is there a trip or an experience abroad that is most memorable to you?
I'd say the early mid 70s doing the west coast of Africa because I traveled by Land Rover and I spent an entire year driving from South Africa all the way to Europe. And I surfed through all the countries in West Africa along the way and had unbelievable adventures, obviously some really great waves, encountered, tribes and cultures that I had no idea, wildlife. And by the same token, I had the biggest bummers. I had the most depressing times. I had periods where I got stuck, broken down in the desert. But I would say the west coast of Africa was my favorite because a lot of good surf breaks, all kinds of waves, a lot of which are being surfed now, like Skeleton Bay. I surfed there before anybody even knew what that was. I surfed Liberia. I surfed, Morocco. I surfed places along the whole west coast of Africa that were just such an experience. And, I was single. I was 20, in my early 20s, and it was just a wonderful adventure. So I would encourage any of your listeners out there that if you get a chance to do surf travel, whether it's a Mentawai boat trip or a trip down to Mexico or whatever, definitely go do it because it'll expose you to different cultures. And I think surfers are some of the best ambassadors of, not only our sport, but a country, because usually they're pretty good about, being cool when they got to travel, because you don't last very long if you're being a butthole.
No, I know it's interesting because I always think of, travel's kind of built into surfing. Because if you love surfing deeply, you're going to go pursue waves, and they're often not going to be in your backyard, and therefore you start to travel. And for me, having done a lot of it, I look back and realize the waves were great, and that was one part of it. But it was also just sort of being in other cultures and meeting new people and the kind of experiences along the way.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, that's what makes it so unique. And I couldn't tell you how many times people say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say Hawaii, and they go, "What? What are you doing here?"
Yeah. Traveling the entire west coast of Africa, did you see any sharks?
More so on the East Coast. Mozambique, I saw tons of sharks. Got chased out of the water in southern Africa by a Zambezi shark at a river mouth. Up the West Coast, not so much because the current, the Benguela current, doesn't lend itself to big sharks up there. It gets too warm. And they like the cold water down in South Africa better. One country I've never surfed in Africa, and I always wanted to go to, was Somalia. But because of the pirates and just how sketchy it is there, that's the one country. I've been on the border in Kenya, looking across the border into Somalia, and I go, I'd like to go there. But no, I surfed, I'd have to look at a map and count them, but, at least probably 20 countries in Africa alone. But shark-wise, South Africa is the place, I think, and obviously Australia. But I think Australia has more shark attacks simply because there's more people in the water nowadays.
Yeah, it sure seems to be happening a lot lately. Thinking about all your years in surfing, surf travel, being on the North Shore, running the contests, et cetera, this is such a broad question, but what's your big takeaway? What have you learned?
Surfing has been really good to me, and I think you see the growth of wave pools, worldwide. People have finally started, there's that quote from Billabong, I think it is, only a surfer knows the feeling. It's so true that until you experience surfing, you don't know how good it is. And if you embrace the lifestyle of surfing, you've embraced a lifestyle that will suit you well for the rest of your life.
Yes, beautiful. I think this is a wonderful, wonderful thing to finish on. I thank you so much, Randy, for taking the time.
It's been my pleasure. And, like I said earlier, I've given a lot to surfing and gotten so much back out of it. And I'm happy to share little stories and with your listeners. And it's my pleasure. And thank you for the opportunity.
Terrific. And we will talk again soon.
All right. As we say from here, aloha.
Soundings is brought to you by the Surfer's Journal and is produced by me, Jamie Brissick, and Jonathan Shiflett. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Our theme song is Give Me a Wave by Asuka Matsumiya and Paz Lenchanting. The Surfer's Journal is a reader-supported publication made possible by sponsorship from Costa Sunglasses, FCS, Finisterre, Howler Brothers, Patagonia, Rainbow Sandals, Vans, and Yeti. The journal is published bi-monthly. If you haven't done so yet, I encourage you to visit surfersjournal.com and subscribe. Thank you for listening to Soundings, and until next time.